The Maiden and the Demon, a Hellboy Hellsing crossover fanfic, written by Maxicorn. Crawl up your own ass and die! To say that Sir Integra Firebrook Wingate's Hellsing was in a foul mood was like saying that an English breakfast was the best way to wake up in the morning. A vast and terrible understatement. She slammed the cell closed with such force one would think it would shatter like glass in her hand. It might have done so if she had the appropriate strength to accomplish such a task. She began to stomp back to her office, her footsteps like those of some ancient prehistoric beast that shook the earth with each stride. The various staff members of the Hellsing organization were wise not to even look at their leader when she was furious, hence why the hallway was suddenly clear of any and all humans. She hated, absolutely hated dealing with the aristocracy. Save for the Queen Mother herself, Integra had very little, if any, respect for anyone with a noble title. Arrogant and backwards lots they were. Just now she had a nice little chat with a duke of some place she didn't really care to know or want to know. He was an insufferable man, ignorant to the threats that plagued humanity. Every other word out of his mouth was either a backhanded insult about her sex or a poorly placed comment that had no real effect on her. Hell, at one point he had the gall to ask her out to dinner. Her! She was very tempted to ask Walter to prepare her private jet, fly to whatever crap hole he called home, and slit his throat from ear to ear with her rapier. She wouldn't be in the wrong. The British Empire would be all the better without him. But no, that would be a waste of her time and a stain upon her blade. Her mood firmly and utterly soured. All she wanted to do was head back to her office, enjoy a nice glass of cognac, smoke one of her premium cigars that was given to her by Sir Pinwood, and listen to some Stevie Wonder. Little Stevie always calmed her when she was irate. And as always, just a few steps behind her was Walter, her ever-present shadow. He could read her mood as easily as one could read a children's picture book. Knowing what she wanted, he asked, "The 78 or the 65? "The 78, she replied, without even looking back. "And leave the bottle." "Yes, Mum." The former assassin vanished just as his master reached her office. She elegantly removed her keys from her pocket and unlocked the door. Her office was her sanctuary, bathed in the light of the afternoon and always welcoming to her. She hung her overcoat on the hook near the door and walked across the old wooden floorboards to take her seat at her beloved desk. She was halfway across the room when she first noticed it. Someone was in her room. She could see out of the corner of her bespectacled eye the form of someone sitting on the couch just to her right. For a second she considered reaching for her gun, but it was then she noticed the smell. She knew the smell all too well. Her muscles relaxed, her nerves settled. She let out a small exhale. This burglar was no mere man or thief or assassin. He was someone who meant her absolutely no harm. "Hey, babe. Tough day at the office?" His voice was low and gruff, like a pit bull that had been given the power of speech. There was also an underlying affection in there somewhere, an affection she didn't really mind. She finally turned her head to see the visitor in all of his glory. He was red, a proper hellish red that covered him from head to toe. His eyes were a golden yellow, a bit scary at first, but once you get used to it, it was actually very beautiful. A pair of nubs stuck out of his forehead, like horns, but shaved down. A brown duster covered his muscular upper torso, a strange insignia emblazoned on the sleeve. A pair of pants and dark boots finished his office wardrobe with a noticeable large silver revolver on his holster. Probably the most notable thing about him, other than his very demonic appearance, was his right hand. Well, it's hard to call it a right hand. It was more like a cudgel in the shape of a hand. It was large and rocky, the same hue as his skin, in the shape of a hand. It seemed the hand belonged to a most monstrous of beings that went beyond the pale of human understanding. This was Hellboy, and he was her boyfriend. "And how the bloody hell did you get into my office?" she yelled, although not as loud as you think. "Came in through the window." That was such a lie. He always lied about how he got into her office. She could never understand how he could sneak into the Hellsing organization without a single person knowing. Hellboy doesn't look the stealthy type, but considering his age, Integra didn't really try to question it. Looking over at her desk, she caught sight of the slightly shifted lid of her box of cigars. It was only then she had also noticed that her guest was taking a long drag of a lit stogie. "Did you go into my stash?" He didn't even try to hide it. "Shouldn't have left it out in the open like that. I never have to hide them because no one was crazy enough to break into my office." She sounded mad at him, but he knew she really wasn't. She was happy to see him. He could tell by the way she walked to her desk and how absent-mindedly she pushed a few strands of her long blonde hair behind her ear. Her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly when he was around. Not that anyone could just notice. Few could. He was one of those few. She spoke again, in a somewhat softer tone. "I take it you had a mission?" "Yep," he answered. "I had to clear out some gremlins in a nearby church in Normandy. Ugly cusses, too. I had some free time, so I stopped by." "Uncle would be upset about it." Uncle. It was the affectionate nickname she had given the founder of the BPRD, Professor Trevor Broom. She hadn't worked with him in very long, only about 10 years or so, but all the times they were marvelous to her. The professor was a close colleague of her late father's. In fact, in her father's notes, he commented that the BPRD and the Hellsing organization have had a great working relationship since the 1940s, when World War II heated up and the U.S. joined the war effort. She had met Uncle Trevor back during her father's funeral. He made it a point to see her, since she was now the new head of the Hellsing organization. Over the years, he became less of an associate in the field of paranormal and supernatural combat, and more of a member of the family, hence her moniker for him. They wouldn't officially begin working together until she was around 15, during a joint mission to root out a surviving branch of the Thule Society. But of all the various institutions she's worked with, Integra liked working with the BPRD the most. They were professional, open-minded, eager to share info and resources, and the agents were far better company than the religious zealots that made up the Iscariots. Dealing with Enrico Maxwell made her long for the company of Professor Trevor. It wasn't until she was around 21 when she had the chance to work with the BPRD's most famous and well-known agent. Past meetings and encounters with them didn't mesh well with Hellboy's schedule, since he was always off on some kind of crazy mission that, even to this day, Integra had a hard time believing, even in her line of work. Her initial impressions of Big Red, as he was called by some of the staff, were honestly surprising. He was grounded, simple in his thinking and methods, and very blue-collar. Honestly, if he were human, she could see him fitting in at some bar, pounding up some pints, before walking home to his family in the middle of the night. As a field agent, she could see why he was so well regarded. Sure, having a big red demon has its his obvious strength and size would help when dealing with supernatural foes like vampires, spirits, zombies, and the like was a great boon for any agency, but he was also surprisingly intelligent and knowledgeable. He knew more about spells and demonic lore than most of the elder staff of Hellsing. Hell, even Alucard liked working with him. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but there was a lot of respect between them. And that was big, since the No-Life King didn't respect a lot of people. She, on the other hand, had different thoughts about him. Now, keep in mind, Sir Integra was no stranger to the attentions and affections of men. She had been chased by soldiers, politicians, nobles, mercenaries, actors, and the like. Most of the time they wanted her either for her looks or her position, and as such she didn't really give them the time of day, giving them the coldest of soldiers. Maybe the reason for her epitaph of England's Iron Maiden, but she thinks she has another title that the men wouldn't dare utter to her face. At least they wished to get a visit from her pet vampire. Hellboy was different, though. He respected her as the leader of a sister organization, as an agent, and as a woman. He had a gruff manner about him, but he was always respectful to her. She found that attractive. Yes, Sir Integra Fairbook Wingate's Hellsing found a man attractive, and he was a demon, no less. After that first mission, they conversed socially, on the phone, in person, in letters. The letters she liked. Over time, Hellboy would try his hand at being poetic, or at least as poetic as someone like him could be. His letters weren't terrible. He was really trying to woo her. But it was the effort that really charmed her. How he would press little flowers into the envelopes, the small little poems he added to the back of the paper, the small scent of Cuban cigars that he would subtly rub into the seal. It was sweet. You'd never hear her say it out loud, but she really did think they were nice. And somewhere along the way, they became something of a couple. It was very secret, with only a few people on either side of the pond knowing about it. It wouldn't look good if the head of the Hellsing organization and BPRD's top operative were found to be in a relationship. Never mind the fact that both of them were very private people who like to keep this sort of thing to themselves. The door opened, and Walter walked in. A tray containing a large bottle of cognac and 2 glasses perfectly balanced into his gloved hand. "Here you are, ma'am," and he stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Hellboy on the couch. "Hey, Walt," he called out to the butler. Walter wasn't really surprised. He figured out that they were having their usual uninvited guests while doing his fetch quest for the madam. How he knew that? Well, that was his butler's secret. With a small smirk, he walked over to the desk and placed the tray on the desk before saying, "I shall cancel your meetings today, ma'am." "Thank you, Walter." He read the mood perfectly. She was stressed and Hellboy was present. This was her personal time, and he would make sure she gets it. He gave a quick nod to both Integra and then to Hellboy, and then headed out of the room. Hellboy liked Walter. If he had a butler, not that he would want one, he would want one like Walter. "Got the 78? He asked. "Of course," she answered. She popped off the top and poured 2 generous servings of the brown liquid. Her mood seemed to lighten the moment Walter left. Not because he was bad company, no, it was because she was now certain that she would be alone with her boyfriend and could finally relax. She reached over to the small radio next to the portrait of her father and switched it on. The dulcet tones of Stevie Wonder emerged from the speakers, filling the room with his music. She took the 2 glasses and sauntered over to him. Yellow eyes watched her approach. It was in these moments that Hellboy thoroughly appreciated how beautiful Integra was. When he asked about her to his adoptive father, the professor always prefaced his descriptions with the exact same statement. "Sir Integra, what a lovely girl." Now, when he said lovely, he didn't mean that in just the aesthetic sense. He meant that more in terms of personality. She was a lovely woman to be around, which is why he enjoyed working with the Hellsing organization so much. Hellboy had the pleasure of working with her father many times over the years. Awesome man he was. He was genuinely saddened when he learned of his passing. He would have gone to the funeral, but he thought he would stick out too much. When he had finally met Sir Integra, his father's descriptions of her didn't really do her justice, both in terms of personality and looks. She was a badass. Enough said. He could see why Alucard could be commanded by a human, much less a woman. She was a hard-ass who took her job seriously and would make anyone who even entertained the thought of pissing her off pay in spades for it. He liked her the moment she lit up her cigar and introduced herself to him. He had dated human women before, thus he was no stranger to wooing females, but Integra was a different sort of animal. If he came at her wrong, she would shut him down and he wouldn't have another chance at her in her own lifetime. But thankfully, with some well-earned advice from Abe and Liz, he was able to endear himself to her. She loved his clumsy poetry and old-fashioned sensibility. As she walked towards him, he couldn't help but marvel at her features. Her creamy tan skin, wavy, long blonde hair, deep azure eyes. Some would say she was too slim, almost lanky in a way, but he would disagree. She had curves. She just hid them well when behind her usual male attire. That was on purpose. She wanted nothing to distract people when she talked. No one noticed her toned, supple legs or ample cleavage. They would see her face and hear her voice for who she was. But Hellboy was special to her. Everyone else got certain Hellsing, the frightening woman who could put a bullet between your eyes for looking at her wrong. He, on the other hand, got Integra the woman. When she was around him, her hair seemed to shine more, her slender face would soften, and her walk would take on a more seductive sway that could raise the temperature of even the deepest pits of hell. Here, he could appreciate her for all that she was. To him, she was a living contradiction. She was the least feminine woman he had ever known, but at the same time, the most feminine. She settled down next to him, handing him his drink as she did. He took a small sip. Hellboy didn't drink a lot of hard liquor. He preferred beer mostly, but his tastes have expanded since he hooked up with Integra Hellsing, who had a wide selection of wines and champagnes and hard drinks on hand. He found himself liking cognac the most, so much so that she keeps a few bottles of the good stuff on hand, if and when he visits. This particular brand was one such bottle. He rolled the liquid around in his mouth a bit before swallowing. "Good year." She sipped from her own glass and nodded. "Damn well better. As much as I paid for it, I'd break someone's back if it tastes like shit." Hellboy smiled. For all her titles and refinements, Integra could use language that could make a sailor blush. "So where's Big Bad?" That's what he called Alucard. Hellboy had fought his fair share of bloodsuckers, but Alucard was something else. He was like a tiger in a room full of kittens. Same family, different levels. He's out doing his job along with the police girl. He had heard of the fledgling vampire that he had taken under his wing. He couldn't remember her name for the life of him, but he was surprised at the news that Alucard had sired a vampire. From what he understood, the no-life king had no sires. Hellboy wanted to see the woman he had turned. She had to be something else to get such a treatment. "So, what's wrong?" he asked. He wanted to approach the subject lightly, not wanting to worsen her already terrible disposition. Based on the way she walked in the room and the drinks that Walter had already brought with him told him enough. His tail sneaked around his coat and coiled around her waist. "Damned nobility!" she cursed, allowing herself to be pulled closer to the red giant next to her. "Asshole Duke thinks that just because I'm a woman, he can speak to me in any sort of way he wants." "Did you catch your name?" She smiled at his question. If he had his way, Hellboy would pay the Duke a nighttime visit and scare the respect into him. He knew Integra could more than stand up for herself. Still, he couldn't help wanting to defend the honor of his girlfriend. "No need to worry, sweets," she said. "He's not worth it. Besides, I don't want him taking time from you." "If you say so, hon." Hellboy emptied the last remains of the brown, dark liquid into his mouth before setting the glass down. In the back of his mind, he'd made plans on getting the name of the Duke from Walter and then arranging for some explosives to be placed under the asshole's car. Nothing lethal, mind you, just enough to get the point across. He pulled her closer with his smaller arm. She offered no resistance. He glanced down at the beauty under his arm. Her scowl had vanished. The tension in her shoulders were gone. A rare, perfect smile graced her lips. Sir Integra was completely and totally defenseless before him, relaxed in a way that rarely anyone sees anymore. She had shed her armor, and now she was exposed to him. She was woman before him, and he was happy to see her. She moaned, her nose firmly placed into his duster. She loved how he smelled. A first for Hellboy. He was always aware of his unique odor. Nothing foul or off-putting like a skunk. It was just different, unique, and for Integra, utterly intoxicating. It was something she never really understood about her, but he wasn't complaining. As long as she was happy, she could sniff him as long as she wanted. "How long can you stay?" He knew what that meant. She wanted him to stay the night. With her. In her bed. Now keep in mind that Integra was a virgin, untouched by any man in that regard. It was a sign of her purity of spirit and utter dedication to her job as leader of Hellsing and defender of the British Empire from the dark forces that threatened her. She didn't have time to worry about such things, and it was something that set her apart from her contemporaries. No, she merely shared the bed with Hellboy. Sex was something they both agreed wasn't needed. Hellboy never pushed the subject, mostly out of respect for her, but deep down, he felt like he was unworthy of such an honor. While Hellboy had the facade of being a wisecracking adventurer, there were still things that bothered him about his special status. He always tried to hide his worries from her, but Integra knew it bothered him. She knew about his insecurities of their relationship, about how he didn't feel like he had deserved her. She thought it was utter rubbish. Of course he was worthy of her. He was worthy of every inch of her. But secretly, unknown to everyone but herself, she wouldn't have minded if Hellboy took her virginity. They had only begun sharing a bed together recently, and there were many a night she considered rolling over and whispering for the agent to take her. But she knew he wouldn't. His respect, his admiration, and his devotion to her was that strong. It almost rivaled Alucard's in that respect. He was silent for a minute, weighing his options, until finally he said, "I could spare a few hours." She wrapped her arms around his massive frame. That was his way of saying yes. Hellboy was such a fool for her. He could face down demons and witches and sea monsters and old-world gods without a second thought, but this woman could effectively wrap him around her finger. Even if he didn't have the time, he would make the time. All for the chance to share a bed with this woman. She always wore the silver-laced nightgown she only wore with him. It was a gift from one of her many admirers. She considered throwing it out, since she had no need to wear such a thing, but part of her told her she should keep it, and she was glad for it. Seeing Hellboy's face when she first showed up to bed with it on was worth it. Needless to say, he liked it. No, he loved it. It showed off her figure, those damned clothes hid so well. It took all of his self-control and legendary willpower not to run out of the room and dive headfirst into the nearest river to cool off. Integra would flaunt it if she wanted to, and she certainly did it around Hellboy. A pair of lips touched his neck. Unbelievably, Integra was a rather touchy woman when it came to intimacy. Her hands would roam, her legs would trace his, her lips would kiss whatever she could, her teeth would bite at his skin. When the mood was right, the woman could not keep her hands off of him. Not that he minded in the first place. He appreciated her attentions and affections. It was more than enough than he was used to anyway. "You hungry?" he joked. A small but aroused moan escaped her lips. "Starving." With cat-like gentleness and swiftness, she glided from her seat and into his lap. "You are just what the doctor ordered." Hellboy gave an amused snort. "I'd better be." She wrapped her arms around his muscular neck before leaning in for a much-needed kiss. He tasted smoky. Not in the same way as the cigar he had just finished. It was more like biting into a nice, well-cooked piece of barbecue. Almost sweet and robust in flavor. There was also a hint of peanuts and chocolate, more likely from the baby roofs he munched on by the dozens. She tasted strong and elegant, like sipping a good cup of English tea, ironically. She had the subtle hint of cognac on her breath, which added to her flavor. Their first kiss came 7 months ago. It was another joint venture between Hellsing and the BPRD. They had taken out a Satanist cult in Edinburgh, who had managed to halfway summon an archfiend known as the Slasher of Veils. It was one of the few times Hellboy and Alucard fought side by side, but it was, in Integra's own words, bloody epic. After the eventual cleanup, Integra and Alucard saw him off at the airport. Just before he boarded the BPRD cargo plane, she asked to speak to him. Alucard seemed to vanish after she made the offer. Hellboy was nervous. He had only just started writing her those poems in the letters. He was scared that she was going to slap him or shoot him. Instead, she got on her tiptoes and kissed him. He was the second man she had ever kissed. The first was Alucard, partly because she was grateful to him for his service to the organization and his protection of her, and partly because she was curious what kissing was like. One of the few times her own desires came to the surface. Alucard didn't question or reject it. It was simply a request from his master, which he obliged. Hellboy was left in a daze. It was quick but passionate. If he wasn't red already, he'd certainly be an extremely crimson right now. She cracked a smile, patted his cheek, and told him she found the poetry to be acceptable, before strolling away, a barely noticeable wiggle in her step. He tried to hide his happiness as he boarded the plane, but anyone who saw him knew that he was as giddy as a teenager. That was many months and heated kisses ago. The feeling out process was over. This was the stage of private passions. Integra grabbed feverishly at his brown duster, pulling him closer to her as their mouths intermingled and danced with each other. Hellboy's tail tightened its hold around her waist as she tightened her arms around his form. But he took care not to crush her with his right hand of doom. He had enough practice with her to know not to do such a thing, even by accident. Sir Integra's legendary self-control was thrown to the wayside. She let go of the persona that she had made for herself, the image of the fearless, unflappable commander of the Hellsing organization. It wasn't needed right now. Her arms were left outside, her armor was discarded. She could figuratively and literally let her hair down and just be herself. Her wants and desires all laid bare. She could have this. She could have him. Hellboy knew this side of her, the side that longed for the simple pleasures of being herself. She never said it out loud. Integra was one never to voice her own wants or desires, but he knew her well enough. The way she touched him when no one was looking, the way her tone softened ever so slightly when she said his name, the way she kissed him with urgency when they were alone. Integra longed for affections, not the kind those blasted nobles pretend to give her, or those that Walter or Alucard give her. She wanted the personal intimacy that only a boyfriend can give. She longed for it, yearned for it, almost demanded it. And Hellboy knew it. That's why he let her take charge in these situations. He wanted her to have this, and he wanted to give it to her, as much as she wanted, and he was happy to do so. She deserved it as much as he did. Finally, they broke away from each other, panting like they had just run a marathon. Integra rested her head on his broad chest and listened to the sound of his heartbeat. The song on the radio changed, setting the mood perfectly for relaxation. "There's a few hours until night," she spoke. "I can have Walter make you something for dinner." Hellboy pondered the offer for a moment. Walt does make a mean steak." Integra snickered. "You and your steaks. Your usual, then?" He nodded. "And those potatoes. You know the ones." "Of course I do, dear." She cuddled closer to his body. "But that can wait for a while. At least until this song ends." The agent sighed heavily, his chest puffing up as a pillow for his woman. "And that's why you run the show, hon?" The song played on, Stevie's smooth tones filling the air around them. Neither wanted to move from their spot, at least until hunger forced them to. She would call for Walter when the time was right. He would fix dinner for Hellboy and receive one of his oh-so-quirky compliments. They would enjoy the evening out on the veranda, smoking her special cigars that only she broke out when he was around. They would retire to her bedroom and allow sleep to conquer their minds and bodies, tangled up in each other's limbs. Then the morning would come. Hellboy would say his goodbyes to Integra and hitch a ride back to the States into the BPRD, where his father would more than likely chew him out for not reporting back after his mission was over. Integra would once again pick up her weapons, slap on her armor, and return to her life as Sir Hellsing, Master of Alucard, and Lord of the Hellsing organization. But all that would come tomorrow. Today they were just man and woman, committed to each other. No labels, no titles, just the two of them, man and woman.